Welcome back to Abortion Ethics 101. I'm a physician and an ethicist. I teach in Switzerland. Class is in session and we are now on lesson number 5. If you're only now joining us, go check the playlist first. We will wait right here. So in our last lesson, we went over how the question of whether gestation should be mandatory or not is a separate question from the question of the status of embryos and fetuses. Even if you grant embryos and fetuses full personhood, the question of whether gestation should be mandatory is still not an absurd question. And if we're not going to answer the question about gestation based on whether we believe that embryos and fetuses have personhood or not, because we can't, we have a few other options in order to try and answer it nevertheless. One way to try and answer that question is to take the angle that this comment is taking. This comment says, the interesting question is, where does a third party, the state, derive a right to compel someone to sustain gestation? And goes on to think that they do not believe that a free society could justify such a thing. Here, the basic idea is that any infringement on people's freedoms requires a really good reason. The default is everyone does as they like, and any limits requires justification. And typically those justifications would include an interest that not only requires protection, but could justifiably be protected by the state. And then the infringement on people's freedoms, the constraint you would introduce would need to pass the usual criteria of necessity, subsidiarity, and proportionality. So it has to be effective. The infringement has to be effective to protect the interests that you're trying to protect. It has to be the least intrusive way to do that, and it has to be worth it. The degree of infringement has to be justified by the good you are trying to protect. It will not have escaped your notice that a lot of the actual disagreement around abortion is actually around that point, because there is, of course, a link between this discussion and the discussion on the status of embryos and fetuses, because if you do believe that embryos and fetuses are full persons, then you have an interest to protect. Then you'd have to decide whether that interest is an interest that should be protected by the state, and some people do think that. Then you have to believe that mandating gestation, so banning abortion, is effective to protect that interest, that it's the least intrusive way to do so, and that it is worth it, that the interest you're protecting justifies the infringement on people's freedoms. At every step, you will lose people. But some people will go through to the end of the reasoning and conclude that therefore abortion should be banned. Those who will not have accepted all the steps will not. They will conclude that abortion should be legal. And as it turns out, countries that have legalized abortion have often done it because they stepped off this reasoning at a very specific point. And that is the criteria of necessity. Because in order to accept that step, you need to believe that banning abortion makes it less likely to happen. And that's actually not borne out by the evidence. Countries that have legal abortion do not tend to have more abortions than countries that ban it. And legalizations often took place in circumstances where politicians, who were often mostly men at the time when these events happened, they realized that actually abortions were taking place, and they were taking place in dangerous circumstances. They were done by people who sometimes knew what they were doing, but not always. There were complications. Women died or became infertile following procedures that were incorrectly done. Basically, abortion was legalized not because one fine morning legislators woke up and thought, oh my goodness, of course, embryos and fetuses have no personhood. What were we thinking? No, instead, they realized that they had a massive public health problem on their hands, and that the best risk reduction measure was legal abortion. But you could, of course, also step off the reasoning steps at a different step. And you could, for example, argue that because we're talking about bodily autonomy, about the self-determination over our bodies within which we have no other choice but to live, mandating gestation, which is burdensome and risky, would always be disproportionate. This would be the argument from strict self-determination. That was an argument of feminist movements at the same time. I happen to doubt that the self-determination argument would have been enough to tip the balance and legalize abortion had there not been the public health argument at the same time. So that's one way to try and answer the question of whether a third party could make gestation mandatory. If you start out from a liberal framework where you think individual freedoms can only be infringed with justification, it's not that they can't be infringed, but they can only be infringed with justification, then you have to check whether there is a justification, and that will require an interest that you need to protect and that the state has a duty to protect. And then you need to accept that the measure, the infringement on people's freedoms is necessary, that is the least intrusive, and that it is proportionate. People who argue for legal abortion from a public health perspective will usually argue that the necessity argument is not fulfilled, that banning abortion doesn't stop it from happening, but only makes it unsafe. People who believe that banning abortion is not the least intrusive way to protect the interests of embryos and fetuses will usually argue for vastly more extensive support for mothers who find themselves without material means or help or a network when their child is born, in order to make the choice of keeping the child an easier one. They may or may not argue at the same time for legal abortion. And proportionality is the mother of all battles. It is a highly subjective assessment, and this is the flashpoint of many, many disagreements in many, many debates. Here, basically, the more you think embryos and fetuses have morally protected rights, including perhaps full personhood, the more likely you are to think that it could be proportionate to make gestation mandatory. That is, of course, if you believe that banning abortion will make it happen less, because remember, necessity comes first. And of course, the more you value the right to self-determination of pregnant people, the less likely you are to think that making gestation mandatory might ever be proportionate. Yeah.